I have always considered myself a skeptic, someone who vehemently rejected any notion of ghosts, hauntings, or supernatural forces. The stories told about restless spirits, shadows in dark hallways, or objects moving on their own were, to me, mere products of the fertile imagination of superstitious minds. I was one of those who thought, there is nothing beyond what the eyes can see, and everything else is just myths created to scare. But since I started working in this old, gloomy school, those deeply ingrained beliefs began to crumble, dissolving into a spiral of doubts and fears I never thought I would feel. My name is Mariana Torres. I'm 31 years old, and I am a literature teacher. At first, the idea of working here seemed delightful. The school, with its imposing architecture and rich history, offered a perfect setting to inspire the restless young minds of my students. I thought I could transform these aged walls, which had witnessed learning for decades, into a refuge of imagination, poetry, and creativity. However, from the very first day I set foot in this building, I realized that something was profoundly wrong, something that eluded me, yet wrapped me in a sense of constant surveillance. It wasn't just the dusty books, the creaking old chairs in the hallways, or the echo of solitary footsteps that unsettled me. It was something more, something that seemed to hide in the shadows. I heard about room 305 during my first week. The conversations about this room were always interspersed with nervous smiles and sidelong glances, as if no one truly wanted to admit what they thought. The school itself had a dark aura, as if it were part of some Gothic novel. Its hallways seemed endless, winding through floors that never seemed to end, and its towering windows let in little light, just enough to cast twisted shadows on the floor. Outside, the abandoned courtyard reflected decay, with dead trees and dry leaves that the wind whipped into frenzied spirals. But nothing in the school seems to be as avoided as room 305. It was there that, many years ago, the old literature teacher was found dead. They said he died alone on a cold winter night, with only his books and manuscripts for company. However, the stories didn't stop there. It was whispered that he never left the place. Some of the older teachers mentioned, with trembling voices, that strange things happened in that room. Windows that closed abruptly, lights flickering for no apparent reason, inexplicable noises echoing through the walls. They laughed at the stories, but the discomfort in their eyes was evident. And no matter how much they scoffed, everyone avoided passing by the corridor that led to 305. When, in my third week, I was informed that I would be teaching in that very room, I felt a chill that I couldn't explain. It was like an invisible weight settling on my shoulders. I recalled all the rumors, the fearful glances exchanged among students, the veiled dread that hung over conversations about the place. They said no one could teach there for long. Something happened, always. But true to my skepticism, I resolved to ignore those stories. They are just exaggerations. I convinced myself, just fables created to impress. However, right in my first lesson in room 305, something felt off. As soon as I entered, I was met with an unusual chill, a cold that shouldn't have been there. The air was so frigid that I had to keep my coat buttoned throughout the class, and even the students, who were usually noisy and distracted, were strangely quiet, restless, as if they felt the same oppressive weight I did. The atmosphere was heavy, dense, almost palpable. It was as if something invisible lingered above us, watching closely every movement, every word. Each minute spent there felt like an eternity, and when the bell rang, I felt an immense relief. But that was only the beginning of something much more disturbing. On a cold autumn night, I stayed late to grade papers. The school was deserted, steeped in a profound silence, broken only by the occasional sound of the wind howling outside. The overhead light flickered constantly, so I brought a lamp from home to create a more comfortable ambience. But as the night wore on, the silence became suffocating. Every page turned seemed to echo throughout the empty building. And then, without warning, something strange happened. I heard the sound of chalk scraping against the blackboard. My eyes widened, the blood freezing in my veins. It was a common sound, the kind we hear every day in a classroom, but in that situation, it transformed into something deeply unsettling. I was alone. I lifted my gaze, desperately searching for a logical explanation. The silence of the room, once a refuge, now turned into an abyss of unease that seemed to swallow all my thoughts. My hands, once steady, began to tremble slightly as my eyes scanned every corner of the empty space, trying to find something, anything, that would explain the sound of chalk scratching the board. My heart beat against my chest, strong and erratic, like a drum echoing inside me, amplifying the anxiety that was already beginning to consume me. The room was shrouded in the soft twilight of the lamp's light, its shadows dancing mockingly on the walls. The desks, meticulously lined up, seemed like inert figures, yet somehow threatening, wrapped in a heavy, dense air, suffused with an inexplicable chill. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks, the result of accumulated fatigue and the suggestion of the rumors that lingered around the school. Just stories, I murmured to myself, even though a part of me couldn't shake the growing sense that there was something very real and terrible in that room. Yet, the sound persisted. The unmistakable noise of chalk continued to trace something invisible to my eyes at that moment, but whose implications were becoming increasingly clear in my mind. At first, I tried to rationalize it, looking for a flaw, a draft, or even a mechanical explanation for what was happening. But when I finally gathered the courage to look at the blackboard, the blood in my body seemed to stop circulating. There it was. The words were written in a handwriting that was not mine, in shaky, uneven strokes, as if drawn by an unsteady hand. An echo of the past materialized in that instant. He never left. Each letter seemed to carry a suffocating weight, a message that pierced the air around me and penetrated directly into my consciousness. It was as if the space around me had contracted, trapping me, suffocating me. A chill ran down my spine, as cold and relentless as a gust of icy wind on a winter's night. It felt as if an invisible presence was beside me, touching me in a subtle yet undeniable way, freezing every fiber of my being. My body froze. My mind struggled to grasp any logical thought, any fragment of reason that could save me from this state of absolute dread. But terror was an overwhelming tide. I was invaded by a primitive sense of vulnerability, as if I were alone in a vast desert, at the mercy of something I didn't understand, but knew was very close. Then, the oppressive silence of the room was brutally shattered. Footsteps. Heavy, methodical steps in the hallway. They echoed with a slowness that felt intentional, almost mocking. Each thud against the floor reverberated in my mind, amplifying the tension until I felt on the brink of collapse. It was as if the very school were alive, conducting a horror show just for me. The footsteps drew nearer, closer and closer, until, with a sharp crack, the door to room 305 burst open violently. I jumped, as if my body were moved by an involuntary reflex of pure adrenaline. Blood hammered in my ears, a persistent thrum that drowned out the sounds around me. I stared at the hallway with wide eyes, expecting to see something, anything, that would explain the noise. But the corridor was empty, shrouded in darkness, punctuated only by the lights flickering erratically, casting irregular flashes that dissed everything around. Silence returned, but it was a false silence, filled with an electricity in the air, a terrible anticipation. Something was very wrong. The lights began to flicker with a disturbing frequency, as if on the verge of extinguishing completely, plunging everything into total darkness. And that's when I saw him. At the end of the hallway, a silhouette emerged, a tall, skeletal figure, wrapped in dense shadows that seemed to devour the little light surrounding it. He did not move, did not approach. He simply stood there, watching. The air around me became almost impossible to breathe. It felt as if an invisible force were pressing down on me, compressing my lungs, making each breath a painful effort. My legs were glued to the floor. My mind screamed to run, but my body refused to obey. It was like being trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake, where time dragged unbearably, each second extending my torment. Then I felt it. A cold touch. Icy, radiating across my skin. Something invisible, something that was beside me. Fear exploded within me, a wave of uncontrollable panic that finally forced my body to react. I turned, heart racing, and there he was. What stood before me was no longer a man but a shadow of what he once was. The face of the former teacher, or at least what remained of him, was a sight that transcended ordinary horror. His skin, pale and stretched in a supernatural way, reflected a ghastly sheen in the flickering light. His eyes were dark caverns, deep holes that seemed to suck in the surrounding light as if they wanted to devour my soul. His mouth, slightly open, emitted a silent scream, a desperate wail that reverberated within me in a tangible way, even though it wasn't a real sound. My mind shattered for a moment, consumed by pure terror. And then I ran. I ran with an urgency I had never felt before, my body moving by pure instinct for survival. The shadows seemed to pursue me, stretching, distorting, like outstretched arms trying to grab me. The sound of the wind intensified, or perhaps it was something else, something moving alongside me. Something I absolutely didn't want to look back at. From the moment I first stepped into High Pines School, the stories about the old locker room in the basement circulated through the halls like shadows. They felt like whispers from a dark past, silently gliding into the ears of the curious, murmuring promises of mysteries and tragedies that no one dared to mention aloud. The words were exchanged in the forgotten corners of the library, during class breaks, in tones almost reverent, as if the school itself could hear and punish those who revealed too much. They said that in the distant years of the 1980s, the basement had been the scene of terrible murders, of young lives brutally torn away. Their souls, unable to rest, still wandered through the shadows of the abandoned locker room. The killer was never caught. A macabre detail that seemed to be intentionally forgotten by all, wrapped in a complicit silence. But what troubled me more than the stories of the murders was the thick mystery hanging over the case, like an invisible fog. It was as if the whole school knew the details, yet no one had the courage to confront the horror openly. I was 16 years old, and unlike the other students who mocked these stories and treated them as mere urban legends, I had always had an inclination toward the unknown. It wasn't just a matter of curiosity. It was an almost obsessive need to prove that none of it was real, to unravel what lay behind the ancient, dirty walls of the school. Felipe and Lucas, my two best friends, shared this desire to challenge fear, or at least pretended to share it. One cold Friday night, we decided it was the perfect time to venture down to the basement and discover for ourselves what truth lay in those stories. A foolish, impulsive decision, driven by youthful adrenaline, that made us believe we were ready for anything. We thought it would be just an adventure, something to laugh about later as we recounted our exploits to the other students. But deep down, none of us were prepared for what was to come. The locker room was located at the heart of the school's basement, a forgotten area locked away for so long that the building itself seemed to have absorbed the darkness of that place. The access door was heavy, secured by a large rusted padlock. Even with time corroding the metal, it still resisted, as if it were there not only to keep people out but also to keep something trapped inside. Yet with a few improvised tools and a lot of determination, we managed to break it. The dry snap shattered the silence of the corridor, and immediately a pungent smell emerged, enveloping us in a wave of discomfort. It was like breathing in a mixture of decades of accumulated mold and something denser, something we initially couldn't identify, but that soon brought to mind the metallic scent of old blood. I gripped the flashlight tighter as we descended the concrete steps, each step reverberating in the empty, claustrophobic space, as if we were entering the very entrails of something alive, waiting for our presence. The air around us felt heavier with each breath, as if it were pulling us down, making the simple act of breathing a conscious effort. The damp walls dripped with dark, cold water that fell slowly and rhythmically, like a sinister metronome marking the time we had in that place. The narrow corridor stretched before us like a hungry mouth, sucking in the light from the flashlight and leaving only an oppressive gloom. The sensation that something was watching us grew more intense, an invisible presence that seemed to slither along the walls, enveloping us without our ability to see it. When we finally crossed the door that led to the locker room, a biting cold hit us. It wasn't just the physical chill of the subterranean environment, but a cold that came from within, settling deep in our bones, as if the very place was imbued with an ancient and malevolent energy. The cracked tiled floor was stained with dark, undefined marks that at first glance could merely be signs of neglect and time, but with the metallic scent that dominated the air, They brought to mind the disturbing idea that there was much more than just dirt here. The walls, once white, were covered with moisture stains and moss, like open wounds that time refused to heal. The silence was oppressive. There were no natural sounds in that place, aside from the persistent dripping of water somewhere distant. Yet even that sound felt forced, out of place, as if the very atmosphere around us was wrong, broken in some way. And there was something else there, something we could not see but felt in every fiber of our bodies. The invisible weight of eyes following us, observing every movement, every breath. Felipe tried to break the silence with a joke, his voice low and trembling, but no one laughed. It was impossible to ignore the crushing discomfort enveloping us. The smell of rust and decay grew stronger with each step, mixing with the thick humidity hanging in the air. Felipe, who was leading the way, began to fidget, glancing around as if he expected to see something emerge from the shadows. Lucas, who had always been the most skeptical of us, was visibly tense. I, on the other hand, fought against the sensation that we were being pulled by something invisible. An ancient force that drew us into the depths of that locker room like a patient predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. That was when we noticed the first marks. On the broken tiles, at eye level, there were deep scratches, as if something or someone had desperately tried to escape from that place. "Man, let's take a quick look and get out of here," Lucas said, his voice wavering, trying to maintain composure but revealing a thin layer of fear that seeped through every syllable. The nervous tone was a reflection of the oppressive environment surrounding us, heavy with an invisible tension, almost palpable, that seemed to root itself in every shadowy corner of the old locker room. Felipe, who usually exuded unwavering confidence, merely nodded silently this time, his eyes fixed on the floor as if trying to avoid the suffocating reality around us. We three began to explore the space, moving in slow, careful steps, as if fearing to awaken something long dormant there. The locker room was a relic of a forgotten past, a scene abandoned to the claws of time and decay. Metal lockers, covered in a thick layer of rust, lined the walls, their doors ajar, revealing darkness and emptiness within. They resembled hungry mouths, ready to devour anyone who dared to get too close, a silent invitation to despair. The air smelled of ancient mold, mixed with something metallic that lingered in the back of the throat, a reminiscence of death, or perhaps of violence. The mirrors above the sinks, once shiny, were now in tatters, their shattered surfaces reflecting only distorted fragments of what passed before them. As I approached one of those mirrors, what I saw made my stomach churn. My own reflection looked wrong. My face, though familiar, was pale, almost spectral, and my eyes, always lively and curious, now seemed like two black holes, absorbing the little light that existed in the room. The contours of my features appeared distorted, as if the mirror was revealing a version of myself I didn't recognize. As we delved deeper into the locker room, the environment around us seemed to acquire a life of its own. The moisture on the walls dripped slowly, like silent tears, while the distant sound of water dripping from a rusty pipe became a constant beat, resonating in my ears like a funeral march. The air grew heavier, as if the space was suffocating us, and the shadows on the walls danced with the light of the flashlight I gripped more tightly now, despite my hands trembling slightly. Then, what had been subtle at first, like a distant breath, began to grow more real, more present. Voices, small indistinct whispers that initially sounded like the wind playing with the cracks in the walls, but soon transformed into something much clearer. They weren't complete words, but there was an intention behind them, a dark urgency. I glanced at Felipe and Lucas, hoping this was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but their wide, pale eyes made it clear they were also listening. "Did you hear that?" Felipe's voice came out hesitantly, almost suffocated by the oppressive atmosphere. He didn't need an answer, as the silence between us screamed louder than any word. Before we could process what was happening, a thunderous sound echoed through the locker room. The sound of locker doors slamming shut on their own, one after another, like a line of dominoes falling, the noise reverberating off the walls and chilling us to the bone. The sound was rhythmic, almost like a macabre symphony orchestrated by an invisible force. My eyes widened, and I felt panic begin to invade my body, as if I were being submerged by a freezing wave of terror. My heart, which had been beating normally until then, was now pounding in my chest, so hard it was almost unbearable. Each beat echoed in my ears like war drums. "We need to get out of here," I shouted, feeling despair consume me entirely. My legs, which had been trembling before, were now moving almost instinctively, propelled by the visceral fear that grew with every passing second. We ran towards the exit door, and as we reached it, the terror only intensified. The door, which we had unlocked with such ease moments before, was inexplicably locked again. I pulled the doorknob with all my strength, feeling despair wash over me when I realized it wouldn't budge. It was as if the locker room had come to life, as if the very place was holding us captive, trapping us in its dark secrets. Lucas, in sheer panic, began to bang frantically on the door, while Felipe tried to force one of the rusty windows that seemed welded to time. At that moment, something in the air around us shifted. The cold that had already enveloped us seemed to intensify, freezing us to the bones. I turned, instinctively sensing that something was wrong, and what I saw made me question my own sanity. In the center of the locker room, among the corroded lockers and cracked tiles, there were figures, bodies. They appeared to be teenagers, their clothes old and worn with time, and their faces were pale, lifeless, covered in dark stains that, upon closer inspection, I realized were dried blood. Their eyes, or what remained of them, were empty holes that seemed to suck in the little light in the room, turning what was already dark into an absolute abyss. They didn't move. They only watched me. The air around me vibrated with their presence, heavy and oppressive, as if death itself had entered that locker room and was closing in on me. One of them, with slow and almost ritualistic movements, raised a hand and pointed directly at me. That gesture, simple yet loaded with meaning, made me feel as if the ground was opening beneath my feet. Reality twisted around me. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat, unable to escape. The only thing I could do was run. Felipe, Lucas, and I, finally fueled by a desperate strength that only fear can provide, managed to break the window and squeeze through it, scratching our arms and legs in the process, but not daring to look back. Terror propelled us forward, and we kept running until we were far, far away from that cursed place. I had never been the kind of person who believed in supernatural things. Throughout my life, I had always taken a practical view of things, seeking logical explanations for what many insisted on calling the inexplicable. To me, ghosts, spirits, and those spine-chilling tales were just that. Stories told on sleepless nights or around campfires, far from any concrete evidence. At least that's what I thought until I began working as a janitor at that school, a place that seemed to exist in a different time, where the walls held more secrets than stories. The building was old, almost decaying in certain areas, with peeling paint and cracked bathroom tiles. But the gym was different. That place always had a peculiar feeling, a dense aura enveloping the environment, as if time there was suspended, trapped in a moment of silent and unchangeable horror. The fluorescent light, often flickering, cast unsettling shadows on the walls, creating shapes that danced and seemed to watch. The students always told stories about the gym, about an entire basketball team that disappeared decades ago, as if their souls still wandered there, trapped between the lines of the court. They said that during a night game, for no apparent reason, the players simply vanished. No bodies were found. No explanations were given. The legends spoke of how, from time to time, one could still hear their screams, trapped in the walls, crying to be set free. I, of course, never believed in those stories. Part of my job was to be there at night, overseeing the building while everyone else was home, resting in a world that felt so distant from mine. In the first few weeks, it was quiet. The routine was repetitive, even monotonous. Clean here, fix a light bulb there, nothing out of the ordinary. Dust danced in the beams of light escaping from the dirty windows, and the smell of fresh wax mingled with the scent of old paper that permeated the air. But eventually, the gym began to stand out in my mind. I felt a presence, something that couldn't be seen, but was definitely there, like a shadow dragging itself in my field of vision, always on the edge of perception. It was hard to explain. a weight in the air that made breathing more difficult, as if the oxygen became scarcer when I passed through that place. The silence was almost palpable, so dense that it seemed like sound itself refused to penetrate there, a shield against any distraction. One night, during a particularly quiet shift, I was sweeping the corridor that led to the gym. The sound of the broom scraping against the floor echoed through the empty hallways, creating a monotonous rhythm that blended with the oppressive silence. Until then, everything seemed normal. But suddenly, the familiar sound of a basketball bouncing reverberated in the air, like a whisper cutting through the stillness. In that moment, I felt a chill run down my spine. Something I had never felt before, a sensation that froze the blood in my veins. The sound was so clear, so distinct, that it couldn't be a trick of my mind. It seemed impossible, since I knew the gym was empty, a silent cavern of memories and echoes. There was no one else there. At least, there shouldn't have been. Curious and somewhat hesitant, I dropped the broom and walked toward the gym, my footsteps echoing strangely in the desolate hallways. With each step I took, the sound of the bouncing ball intensified, like an insistent call drawing me closer. The echo bounced off the corridor walls, creating an uncomfortable sensation, as if the space were watching me or leading me to something I shouldn't see. The light along the corridor seemed to dim, and a deeper shadow formed ahead of me, as if something were lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. When I finally pushed open the gym doors, the sound grew louder, reverberating against the walls of the court, becoming an unsettling symphony. The gym was empty, completely empty. Yet there, in the center of the court, a basketball bounced alone, slowly, as if someone had just thrown it. The scene was surreal, almost absurd, but so intriguing that I couldn't look away. The echo of the bounces filled the vast space, resonating unnaturally against the metal beams of the ceiling, creating a ghostly chorus that mingled with the heavy air. I stood at the entrance, my eyes fixed on the ball, as a feeling of unease began to swell within me. Something wasn't right. The sensation that there was something more, an invisible entity inhabiting that space, intensified. The chill that settled in my gut seemed to paralyze me, while the awareness that I was alone became oppressive. I could feel a current of cold air swirling around me, as if the very atmosphere were breathing, whispering secrets hidden in the past. My thoughts spun, a storm of confusion and fear, and the need to understand what was happening became an obsession. It was as if the gym were alive, pulsing to its own rhythm, and I was merely an intruder in its domain. The walls, with their signs of wear and the graffiti of forgotten students, seemed to watch me, waiting to see what I would do next. The silence, once comforting, now became a burden, heavy and distressing, making my heart race and my breath uneven. The sound of the bouncing ball, now more pronounced, echoed almost like a summons, a provocation challenging me to approach, to uncover the truth hidden there. Fear and curiosity wrestled within me, an internal clash that left me paralyzed. On an impulse, I took a step forward, the floorboards creaking under my weight. With each movement, the echo of the ball became more intense, more immersive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Something that could change everything, that could pull me into a world I didn't understand, but was beginning to reveal itself before me, a fissure in the reality I once considered solid. I approached slowly, cautiously, trying to listen beyond the sound of the ball bouncing. The silence around me was absolute, a stillness that seemed to envelop everything, like a heavy cloak suffocating even the faintest echoes. Every step I took sounded louder than usual, the thud of my sneakers on the polished wooden floor echoing like a distant drum, reverberating in the emptiness. The ground felt like a trap, ready to swallow me whole, to absorb me into its cold, indifferent being. The court was illuminated only by the dim, flickering light of the old lamps hanging from the ceiling, which blinked from time to time, casting dancing shadows on the bleachers, shadows that seemed to twist and writhe, as if they had a life of their own. Suddenly, the sound of the bouncing stopped abruptly, and the ball, now motionless, rolled to my feet and came to rest, as if it had decided to take a break. But before I could react, the screams began. They came from all directions, a dissonant clamor that ripped through the silence with a violence that left me paralyzed. They were screams of despair, of pain, echoing off the walls as if trapped there, struggling to escape from something terrible lurking in the shadows. I shut my eyes for a second, trying to regain control over myself, desperately convincing my mind that this was impossible, that it couldn't be real. But the screams didn't stop. On the contrary, they intensified, transforming into an unbearable cacophony, seeming to emanate from within the very walls, as if the gym were alive, trying to communicate something dark. I looked around, desperate, searching for the source of those sounds, and that's when I saw them. In the bleachers, shadows moved, nebulous and indistinct outlines, but clearly human, entwined in the darkness. They had no faces, but their eyes, or at least what I presumed to be eyes, were fixed on me with an intensity that made my heart race. I watched, terrified, as the shadows slid between the rows of seats, like spectators of a game that never took place, a match in which all the players were absent, yet the pain and suffering remained. I didn't know if they were real or just a product of my despair, a trick of my mind, but they were there, watching me with a hunger I couldn't comprehend. The feeling that something was wrong became unbearable, like a growing weight in my chest, and then I realized I was not alone. I felt a cold weight on my back, a chill running down my neck, as if an icy hand was trying to reach me. Something was behind me, and the presence was oppressive, an invisible force approaching slowly. I hesitated to turn around at first, but the feeling of being watched intensified with each passing second, a weight in the atmosphere that seemed to choke my breath. Finally, unable to bear the terror any longer, I turned. And there they were. The missing students, their pale, disfigured forms, their faces marked by indescribable suffering, transformed into masks of terror. Empty, lifeless eyes stared at me, and their mouths contorted into a silent scream, a desperate plea for help that seemed to echo within me. The dread I felt at that moment was indescribable, a primal terror that paralyzed me. My feet were glued to the ground, as if the very gym had decided to keep me there, binding me to its history of horror. Reality around me seemed distorted, the air thick and suffocating, wrapped in a shroud of despair, as if I were being dragged into a parallel dimension of nightmares. I wanted to run, but my body was in a state of shock, incapable of reacting. The figures began to approach slowly, their hands outstretched toward me, as if they wanted to pull me into the same fate as theirs, inviting me to share in their torment. The feeling that the very ground was moving beneath my feet, a subterranean current trying to swallow me, grew stronger, a subtle but relentless motion. The screams became unbearable, a chorus of pain vibrating in my gut, and all I wanted was to escape, to flee from that unbearable scene. Suddenly, darkness enveloped me, a wave of shadows that completely consumed me. I don't remember what happened afterward. Everything faded to white, a void where thoughts dissolved. When I woke up, it was already day. I was found unconscious in the gym, still trembling with cold and fear, my face slick with sweat, the taste of terror lingering bitterly in my mouth. Yet, there were no signs of anyone else in the place. No students, no shadows, no screams. Everything was quiet, almost as if nothing had happened, as if the gym had decided to silence its pain. But I knew the truth. I knew what I had seen, the horrific images etched in my mind like deep scars. I quit my job that very day and never returned to that place, that space that had now become a symbol of my fear. Since then, the gym has remained closed, abandoned, covered in the dust of forgetfulness. Yet the stories never ceased, circulating among the students, whispered in dark corridors. They say that occasionally someone still hears the sound of bouncing balls at night, resonating in the solitude of the empty space, and the screams of the missing students continue to echo in the hollow walls, forever trapped in the limbo of that cursed gymnasium, a prison for lost souls waiting for a rescue that will never come.